Welcome to the adventure of the Electrified Spectre, a Sherlock Holmes adventure from the series The Clockwork Conspiracies. Sherlock Holmes and the Age of Innovation, playing in the year 1895. It is with a curious sense of rediscovery that I address you. These accounts, you see, were never intended for the public ear in this form, but rather committed to Edison's remarkable wax cylinders, my private audio case notes, as it were. They lay sealed for decades within a vault at the Royal Society, preserving details perhaps too intimate or atmospheric for my published chronicles. This was an era, the late 19th century, a veritable age of innovation, where the marvels of science, from the electrification of our great city to the nascent motor car, brought forth not only progress, but also novel avenues for human villainy. My friend, Mr. Sherlock Holmes, found himself uniquely challenged by these clockwork conspiracies, where the cutting edge of technology so often became the murderer's new blade or the swindler's ingenious disguise. From this collection of rather unique recordings, I shall now recount a most singular affair. I call this one The Adventure of the Electrified Spectre. Chapter. The late autumn of '92 had settled upon London with a pervasive gloom, a season mirroring, perhaps, the rather somber turn of events that were shortly to engage the singular talents of my friend, Mr. Sherlock Holmes. A persistent drizzle wept against the window panes of our Baker Street lodgings, its soft patter a constant companion to the distant clatter of hansoms on the wet cobbles, providing a mournful rhythm to the afternoon. Within, Holmes himself was in one of his introspective moods. He was lost amidst the curious chemical experimentations that often occupied his less active hours, the occasional clink of glass or a sudden hiss from his apparatus barely disturbing the quiet. The acrid scent of his work mingled with the familiar aroma of his strong tobacco. It was into this atmosphere of quiet contemplation, punctuated only by the gentle crackle of the fire in the grate, that Mrs. Hudson's voice, slightly muffled by the door, announced a visitor. A moment later, the firm tread of determined footsteps sounded upon our stair, growing louder with each step, followed by a crisp knock at our door. Upon my bidding, "Come in," the door opened to admit a woman of striking appearance. Her attire was practical yet neat, her gaze direct and intelligent. This was Inspector Evelyn Hardcastle of Scotland Yard, a name not unknown to us, though her visits were infrequent. "Inspector Hardcastle, do come in. A dreadful day to be abroad," Dr. John Watson said. "Indeed, Dr. Watson. Mr. Holmes, I trust I am not intruding unduly," replied Inspector Evelyn Hardcastle. Her voice was clear and steady, holding a note of professionalism that brooked no nonsense. She brushed a stray raindrop from her shoulder. Holmes sprang to his feet, his earlier languor vanishing. With a swift gesture, he indicated our visitor's chair. "Not at all, Inspector. Your presence invariably heralds something of interest. Pray be seated. You have a case, I presume, that deviates from the Yard's usual diet of pickpockets and domestic quarrels," stated Sherlock Holmes. Inspector Hardcastle settled into the chair, the creak of its springs a brief sound in the otherwise quiet room. Her expression was grave, and she wasted no time on pleasantries. "That is precisely so, Mr. Holmes. I am confronted with a series of deaths, baffling in their nature and alarming in their implications," remarked Inspector Evelyn Hardcastle. "Deaths, you say? How many and under what circumstances?" replied Sherlock Holmes. "Three, to be exact. All members of the Theosophical Society of the Golden Dawn, a rather popular spiritualist circle," answered Inspector Evelyn Hardcastle. Holmes leaned forward, his eyes, keen and bright, fixed upon her. "Spiritualists, an intriguing milieu for murder. And the cause of these deaths, Inspector," Sherlock Holmes pointed out. "That is the crux of the mystery. Each victim was attending a séance. Each died, seemingly, of extreme fright. Their faces were contorted in terror." Inspector Evelyn Hardcastle answered. "Good heavens! Fright alone," commented Dr. John Watson. Not entirely, Dr. Watson. More peculiarly, Mr. Holmes, each bore faint, yet distinct, markings upon their skin, almost like burns, but of a character I have never before encountered, responded Inspector Evelyn Hardcastle. Markings, describe them, Sherlock Holmes said. Our police surgeon, Dr. Phillips, tentatively describes them as electrical injuries. Inspector Evelyn Hardcastle answered. I confess, a shiver ran down my spine at her words, and I unconsciously glanced towards the flickering gaslight, as if seeking reassurance from its mundane glow. The notion of death by supernatural fright was unsettling enough, but combined with these strange physical signs, it painted a truly disturbing picture. Electrical injuries during a séance. Good heavens, Inspector, what could that imply? Dr. John Watson inquired. Precisely what I hope you might help us discern, Mr. Holmes, said Inspector Evelyn Hardcastle. Her tone held a trace of weariness. The public is on the verge of panic, whispering of vengeful spirits and spectral assassins. My superiors are less than receptive to theories involving advanced galvanic apparatus in such a setting. They lean towards overwrought imaginations and weak hearts, answered Inspector Evelyn Hardcastle. And you, Inspector, you do not subscribe to the theory of weak hearts and overwrought imaginations, I take it, Sherlock Holmes observed sharply. His voice was thoughtful, probing, cutting through the gloom of the room like a searchlight. I subscribe to evidence, Mr. Holmes, and the evidence points to something more tangible, answered Inspector Evelyn Hardcastle. Tangible evidence is always a good starting point. What does Dr. Phillips surmise beyond the mere presence of electrical injury? Stated Sherlock Holmes. He has posited, though he admits it is speculative, that a sufficiently sophisticated electrical discharge, precisely targeted, might stimulate the nerves in such a way as to induce cardiac arrest, replied Inspector Evelyn Hardcastle. The fright they exhibited could well be a physiological reaction to an intense, localized shock, rather than a purely psychological terror, remarked Inspector Evelyn Hardcastle. Holmes steepled his fingers, his gaze distant. The rhythmic patter of rain against the glass and the muted rumble of distant traffic seemed to fade as he considered her words. The notion of a scientifically induced death, masked by the trappings of spiritualism, clearly appealed to his logical mind, far more than any talk of phantoms. Fascinating. A most ingenious hypothesis, Inspector. Targeted nerve stimulation, explained Sherlock Holmes. He paused, a spark of intellectual excitement in his eyes. The scent of his earlier chemical experiment seemed to sharpen in the air, as if mirroring his quickening thoughts. This suggests a knowledge of anatomy and electrotherapeutics far beyond that of your average charlatan. Tell me more of this Golden Dawn Society and its leader. It is led by a Madame Evangeline, a medium of considerable renown. Her séances are exclusive, attracting many prominent members of society. Inspector Evelyn Hardcastle said. Prominent members. And the victims themselves, stated Sherlock Holmes. All established figures, Mr. Holmes, men of influence and wealth, said Inspector Evelyn Hardcastle. And the apparatus of these séances. Any unusual electrical devices present under the guise of spiritual communication, perhaps, observed Sherlock Holmes. His voice was sharp now, cutting to the practical details with an almost audible click of his mind, engaging a new facet of the problem. That is difficult to ascertain. The rooms are always dimly lit, and access is strictly controlled. But the possibility of concealed technology is certainly one I cannot dismiss. Inspector Evelyn Hardcastle said. Holmes rose, his chair scraping back slightly, and began to pace before the fireplace, his footsteps measured on the rug. This was the familiar sign that his mind was fully engaged. The rain continued its dreary tattoo against the glass, a counterpoint to the quickening rhythm of his thoughts. A confluence of superstition and science, Watson, Sherlock Holmes said. He paused in his pacing, turning to me, a glint in his eye, a most fertile ground for villainy. The challenge, as always, will be to peel away the layers of the irrational to expose the cold, hard facts beneath. He then addressed Inspector Hardcastle directly, his tone shifting from musing to decisive. Inspector, I find this matter to be of considerable interest. Indeed, it presents features of peculiar novelty, remarked Sherlock Holmes. To observe this Madame Evangeline and her methods first-hand would seem an essential first step. You mean to attend one of these séances, Holmes, remarked Dr. John Watson. Precisely, my dear Watson. Where else might we hope to observe the mechanics of this electrified spectre at its work? Deduced Sherlock Holmes. He turned back to Inspector Hardcastle, a hint of a smile playing on his lips. Inspector, your assistance in gaining us entry would be invaluable, Sherlock Holmes responded. A flicker of something akin to relief passed over Inspector Hardcastle's face. She even allowed herself a small, almost imperceptible nod. The prospect of Holmes's involvement clearly offered a beacon of hope in her perplexing investigation. The game, as Holmes was so fond of saying, was afoot once more, and the scent of an extraordinary puzzle, much like the lingering aroma of his chemicals, had already banished the last vestiges of his earlier ennui. A November chill clung to us as our hansom rattled through Bloomsbury's respectable, yet sombre, streets. We were bound for Madame Evangeline's, a name recently synonymous with marvelous phenomena. Inspector Hardcastle, however, had painted a grimmer picture, speaking not of spirits, but of tangible, disturbing evidence. He had described victims exhibiting signs of extreme fright, yes, but also peculiar burn marks and muscular contortions consistent with powerful electrical shock deaths. He insisted that pointed to a sophisticated, scientific method of murder rather than supernatural intervention. The tall, narrow house was dark, save for a faint flicker on the first floor, suggesting low gas lamps. A sharp rap, the door creaked open, admitting us to a hushed hall, heavy with beeswax and a faint, unplaceable metallic tang. A silent, somber-faced manservant ushered us upstairs, the staircase groaning softly. The séance parlor, draped in heavy burgundy velvet, muffled street sounds. The air felt close. I observed curious brass and glass contraptions on a side table, wires snaking discreetly to the room's corners. A dozen individuals sat in a circle, pale and expectant in the dim gaslight. Among them I recognized Lord Ashworth, his features drawn, shoulders bowed in profound grief. His voice was a low murmur beside me, barely disturbing the oppressive quiet. Watson, observe our fellow seekers. Grief, yes, but also a peculiar eagerness. And the apparatus far more sophisticated than the usual tambourines and cheesecloth, wouldn't you say? Declared Sherlock Holmes. Before I could reply, a rustle of silk announced our hostess. Madame Evangeline, a woman of indeterminate age, had dark hair swept from a pale, striking face. Her large, luminous eyes seemed to absorb the dim light. She moved with quiet grace. Her voice, like velvet, held an undercurrent of steel that commanded attention. Welcome, seekers of truth. The veil between worlds is thin tonight. Let us prepare our hearts and minds to receive those who would communicate, Madame Evangeline said. The gas lamps lowered, plunging the room into profound gloom, relieved by a single candle casting long, dancing shadows. A peculiar hum emanated from the brass and glass devices, growing from imperceptible to a subtle vibration that resonated within my bones. My skin prickled, the hairs on my hands stirred, as if from an unseen current. This palpable sense of the electrical apparatus, a modern magic, was more disquieting than any talk of spirits. Madame Evangeline spoke in soft, rhythmic, hypnotic tones. I watched Holmes, his profile sharp in the dim light. His attention was not on her, but on the room. His gaze swept methodically from cornices to floorboards, lingered on a glinting wire near the skirting board, then to the sitter's arrangement. He remained an island of calm, analytical thought in a sea of rising emotion. Faint raps commenced, seemingly from the walls. A cold draught swept the room, making the candle flame gutter wildly. A woman near Lord Ashworth gasped, her voice a thin thread of fear. Then a soft, ethereal light flickered above the central table, hovering, pulsating. Lord Ashworth leaned forward, his breath catching in a sob. His voice trembled. "Elena, is that you, my dearest?" Lord Ashworth said. The light pulsed once, then slowly faded. The séance continued thus for nearly an hour, with whispers, touches, and the scent of unseen flowers. Finally, Madame Evangeline, her voice tinged with exhaustion, declared the spirits withdrawn. The gas was raised, revealing faces flushed with excitement, fear, or, for Lord Ashworth, sorrowful hope. As we made our way out, descending the creaking stairs once more, Holmes paused, his fingers brushing lightly against a small, newly installed brass plate near the door jamb, almost hidden by a heavy drape. He spoke quietly, his tone thoughtful. "An intriguing performance, Watson. The lady possesses a considerable talent for stagecraft. But did you observe the terminals on that induction coil? Not the work of a common charlatan, I fancy. There is a degree of technical proficiency here, a certain precision in the deception that speaks of more than mere sleight of hand," declared Sherlock Holmes. Outside, the crisp night air carried the lingering metallic tang from the séance room. Holmes's words echoed Hardcastle's concerns about the scientific nature of the deaths. The sophistication Holmes noted suggested a deeper, more organized enterprise than we first anticipated. I felt a familiar stirring of anticipation for the complexities ahead. The disquieting sensations of Madame Evangeline's séance clung to me like a ghostly shroud, long after we had left her incense-laden parlor. The almost palpable hum of the electrical apparatus, the strange ozone tang in the air, these impressions clung to my senses, making the mundane clamor of a London morning seem almost jarring. It was therefore with a sense of grim purpose that Holmes and I found ourselves, later that day, within the somewhat austere confines of Scotland Yard. The rhythmic clatter of typewriters from an adjacent office and the hurried tread of boots on the worn linoleum floor formed a constant, subdued chorus around us, a stark contrast to the séance room's eerie quiet. Inspector Evelyn Hardcastle received us in a small, utilitarian office. Papers were stacked with military precision upon her desk, alongside a half-empty teacup. A single gas lamp hissed softly on a nearby bracket, casting a steady, unwavering glow that did little to dispel the room's inherent gloom or the shadows that danced in the corners. She looked tired, lines of worry etched around her eyes, yet her gaze was direct and resolute. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, your prompt arrival is noted. I have intelligence which, I am quite certain, bears directly upon the unfortunate deaths we discussed," said Inspector Evelyn Hardcastle. "Pray continue, Inspector," Holmes replied, his voice sharp with interest. Sherlock Holmes responded. I noticed his keen eyes darting about the room, no doubt cataloguing every detail from the scuffed skirting boards to a single, smudged fingerprint on a teacup. Inspector Hardcastle drew a thick folio towards her, its cover worn at the edges. The rustle of paper was loud in the otherwise quiet room. Over recent months, a pattern of peculiar thefts has emerged across the city, specifically highly specialized electrical components, Inspector Evelyn Hardcastle said. She opened the folio, revealing neatly penned lists and what looked like technical diagrams. The scent of official ink and old paper drifted across the desk. "We're seeing thefts of bespoke capacitors, copper wiring of a very specific gauge, and certain magnetic coils. The acquisitions demonstrate remarkable precision, no forced entry, suggesting either internal access or perpetrators of considerable skill," remarked Inspector Evelyn Hardcastle. Holmes nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on the inspector. Our current attribution for these sophisticated thefts is to a collective known colloquially as the Clockwork Gang, answered Inspector Evelyn Hardcastle. The Clockwork Gang, I interjected, the name sounding more fanciful than felonious. Dr. John Watson commented, "Affirmative, Doctor. The appellation Clockwork Gang is not without reason. It stems from their almost preternatural methodical planning and flawless execution of their crimes." Inspector Evelyn Hardcastle said. A telephone rang distantly in the corridor, its bell muffled by closed doors, a reminder of the bustling police work continuing beyond this small office. Their grasp of modern technology, electrical and mechanical systems in particular, is notably advanced. Hitherto, their operations appeared limited to component acquisition, likely for resale or perhaps for some internal fabrication project of their own. Inspector Evelyn Hardcastle replied. Holmes, who had been listening with an air of placid attention, suddenly leaned forward, his eyes alight with a familiar spark. And these components, Inspector, his voice was sharper now, cutting through the low hum from the corridor, do they bear any resemblance to the apparatus employed by Madame Evangeline during her performances? Deduced Sherlock Holmes. Inspector Hardcastle paused, a flicker of surprise in her eyes. A connection I, too, was beginning to formulate, Mr. Holmes. Indeed, certain items on our inventory of stolen goods are remarkably similar, or at least adaptable, for the kind of apparatus you described witnessing, said Inspector Evelyn Hardcastle. She tapped a finger on one of the lists in the folio. Outside, the rumble of a heavy dray cart on the cobbled street below briefly intruded. My preliminary hypothesis was that the Clockwork Gang might be Madame Evangeline's supplier wittingly or otherwise on her part, or indeed that she herself holds a more direct affiliation with them, answered Inspector Evelyn Hardcastle. A plausible theory, Inspector, Holmes mused, tapping his long fingers together on the arm of his chair, the sound a quiet counterpoint to the inspector's steady voice. But perhaps too straightforward for a group named for clockwork precision. Sherlock Holmes responded, consider their sophistication. This is not mere pilfering for parts to sell on. This is targeted acquisition of advanced, perhaps even esoteric, technology, explained Sherlock Holmes. What if their interest, their ultimate aim, extends far beyond simply supplying a spiritualist, however fraudulent she may be? Sherlock Holmes observed sharply. He rose and began to pace the small office, his lean figure casting a restless shadow in the gaslight. The floorboards creaked faintly under his tread. From somewhere deep within the yard, the distant clang of a cell door, heavy and final, punctuated the silence. These séances, Watson, he began, his voice taking on a graver tone, with their peculiar electrical manifestations and tragic, terrifying outcomes. What if they are more than mere charlatanry? Remarked Sherlock Holmes. What if the Clockwork Gang is not merely a supplier of parts, but a developer of something far more insidious? Imagine, Inspector, a technology capable of inducing such profound terror, such specific and fatal injury, remotely and with an almost perfect degree of deniability. The components they steal are not for show, not for simple trickery. They are for function, a deadly precise function, Sherlock Holmes pointed out. His words painted a chilling picture, and I felt a cold unease settle upon me, the very air in the small office seeming to grow colder. The hiss of the gas lamp suddenly sounded louder in the ensuing quiet. Your inference, Mr. Holmes, is that they are weaponizing this technology, employing these séances as a proving ground, or, dare I consider, fulfilling commissions for murder, replied Inspector Evelyn Hardcastle. Precisely, Holmes affirmed, his gaze intense, boring into the inspector. An untraceable method of assassination, cloaked in the comforting guise of superstition, Sherlock Holmes observed sharply. The perfect crime, perhaps, sold to the highest bidder. The Clockwork Gang's primary profit motive may be far grander and infinitely more sinister than the simple theft and resale of parts, stated Sherlock Holmes. We must discover the source of their advanced understanding. These are not common components, Inspector, nor is the knowledge to wield them so effectively readily available, deduced Sherlock Holmes. He stopped his pacing abruptly and looked towards the grimy window, where the grey, indifferent London sky pressed close, offering no answers. Our next step, then, is clear. We must trace these unique components back to their very origin. There must be an inventor, a mind capable of conceiving such devices before they were so cruelly perverted to nefarious ends, observed Sherlock Holmes. The only sound for a moment was the scratching of Holmes's fingernail against his chin as he pondered. Inspector, do your records indicate any prominent researchers or engineers whose work aligns with these highly specialized technologies? Perhaps someone who has recently reported thefts of intellectual property or even prototypes. One individual does present himself, though his reputation is considerable, Professor Augustus Flemming. His contributions to advanced electrical systems are seminal, though I confess, viewed by some within the establishment as rather recondite, even eccentric. Inspector Evelyn Hardcastle answered. Professor Augustus Flemming, Holmes repeated, the name rolling off his tongue with a certain decisiveness. Then to Professor Flemming we shall go, Watson. It is imperative we understand the nature of this misused knowledge before more lives are extinguished by these electrified spectres, declared Sherlock Holmes. Our hansom drew up before a tall, narrow house in a less fashionable quarter of Bloomsbury, from which emanated a faint, persistent hum, a sound suggestive of contained power. This, Holmes had ascertained, was the residence and workshop of Professor Augustus Flemming. As we were admitted, the scent of ozone and heart metal met my nostrils, and the hum resolved itself into the whirring of unseen dynamos from somewhere deep within the dwelling. Professor Flemming himself greeted us in a cluttered study that seemed more laboratory than library. He was a man of middle years, with ink stains on his fingers, spectacles perched precariously upon his nose, and an air of abstracted brilliance. His laboratory coat was singed in several places, a testament, I presumed, to the ardor of his experiments. Professor Flemming, I believe. My name is Sherlock Holmes, and this is my colleague, Dr. Watson. We are here to consult you on a matter of grave importance, touching upon your unique researches into advanced electrical systems, explained Sherlock Holmes. The professor blinked, adjusting his spectacles, his gaze sharpening with interest at the mention of his work. When he spoke, his voice, though quiet, was surprisingly resonant, cutting through the low thrum of machinery from his workshop. Indeed, my work is largely theoretical, Mr. Holmes, focused on the purer aspects of electromagnetism. I am not often consulted by gentlemen such as yourselves, responded Professor Augustus Flemming. Holmes gestured towards a workbench laden with intricate coils of wire and glass tubes from which faint lights flickered. Precisely, Professor. We have reason to believe that certain aspects of your theoretical work, particularly concerning a unique electromagnetic resistant material you have developed, may have found a practical application, deduced Sherlock Holmes. Flemming led us towards a section of his workshop where a delicate galvanometer was set up beside a formidable-looking induction coil. The air here crackled almost imperceptibly. A spark of academic pride lit Professor Flemming's features as he exclaimed, "Ah, you refer to my etheric shielding compound. Its properties are quite remarkable for creating stable experimental environments. Allow me to demonstrate," said Professor Augustus Flemming. He carefully draped a thin, dull gray sheet of what appeared to be a woven metallic fabric over the galvanometer. Observe. He then threw a switch, and a startling blue spark, accompanied by a sharp crack, leaped across the terminals of the induction coil. Yet, The needle of the shielded galvanometer remained perfectly, uncannily still. Holmes watched the demonstration with an unnerving intensity, his grey eyes narrowed in thought. Most impressive, Professor. This material, then, it is more than a mere insulator, Sherlock Holmes noted. Professor Flemming nodded eagerly, his eyes alight with scientific fervor. Infinitely more, Mr. Holmes. It forms directional conduits for electromagnetic energy or shields against specific frequencies. One could create a parallel circuit, invisible to detection, bypassing safeguards and overriding interlocks to deliver targeted energy. Professor Augustus Flemming said, I confess, a chill traced its way down my spine at the implications, despite the workshop's stuffy warmth. The low thrum of the dynamos suddenly seemed to possess a more sinister undertone. Holmes's voice turned grave. Professor, consider this. Such a material, capable of channeling a powerful electrical force undetectably, bypassing all safeguards, could it not be employed as a weapon? Declared Sherlock Holmes. The professor's already pale face lost what little color it possessed. He stared at Holmes, his mouth agape, the earlier academic enthusiasm extinguished as if by a douse of cold water. When Professor Flemming found his voice, it trembled slightly. A weapon? Good heavens, Mr. Holmes, the thought is monstrous. My work. It was intended for the advancement of science, for creating environments where delicate experiments could flourish, free from interference. Never, never for harm, for such malicious application, Professor Augustus Flemming answered. His distress was palpable. His spectacles had begun to mist, and he wrung his ink-stained hands together. The distant whirring of some unseen apparatus seemed to underscore his profound shock. Holmes's tone softened slightly, yet lost none of its firmness as he stated, Yet, Professor, it appears your theoretical marvel has indeed found a practical and tragically malevolent application. We have strong reason to believe the Clockwork Gang has acquired access to your discovery or the means to replicate it. Sherlock Holmes responded. Professor Flemming looked utterly crushed. He whispered, The Clockwork Gang. But how? My research, my prototypes, I guard them meticulously. This is a perversion, Professor Augustus Flemming replied. Holmes regarded the distraught inventor not with accusation, but with a grim understanding of how intellectual triumphs can be twisted to serve dark purposes. He rose from the stool upon which he had perched. The ingenuity of man, Professor, for good or ill, is a powerful current. Your unwitting part in this tragedy is a heavy burden, I can see, but the information you have provided is invaluable. Come, Watson, explained Sherlock Holmes. Holmes turned towards the door. Our inquiries must now lead us to one who has suffered most directly from this terrible misuse of science. We shall pay a visit to Lady Ashworth. As the workshop door clanged shut behind us, it seemed to seal Professor Flemming within his shattered ideals, while the shadows of our case loomed ever darker. The gloom of Ashworth Manor seeped into the very air we breathed. Heavy curtains blocked the weak afternoon sun, casting long shadows across the opulent, yet cheerless, room. Silence hung in the air, broken only by the distant tick-tock of a grandfather clock. The scent of funeral lilies mingled with beeswax and old tapestries. Lady Ashworth entered, a figure swathed in the deepest black, her face pale and etched with what appeared to be profound grief. Her movements were slow, her hands clasped tightly before her, the rustle of her mourning crepe a whisper in the stillness. Her voice, when she spoke, was low and trembled slightly. Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, thank you for coming. This is all so dreadful, answered Lady Ashworth. Holmes inclined his head, his expression one of professional sympathy, yet his eyes, I noted, were intensely alert. Lady Ashworth, we are here to offer what assistance we can. Pray tell us of the events of that night, as you recall them, observed Sherlock Holmes. She recounted the séance, her voice faltering as she described the flickering lights and the oppressive atmosphere. Then came the sudden, horrifying moment of her husband's demise. She spoke of a blinding flash, a sound like tearing silk, and Lord Ashworth's terrible cry. It was a harrowing tale, delivered with every appearance of genuine anguish. He simply collapsed, Lady Ashworth continued, her voice breaking. There was a peculiar odor like ozone. The doctor said it was his heart. But oh, Mr. Holmes, the terror in his eyes, Lady Ashworth replied. His tone was gentle. Indeed, and the room itself, Lady Ashworth, were there any unusual arrangements? Any new apparatus brought in by Madame Evangeline? Declared Sherlock Holmes. Only her usual instruments, the table, the cabinet, though I did notice some new wires. She said it was to better channel the spiritual energies, to prevent any uncontrolled manifestations, answered Lady Ashworth. It was here that Holmes's questioning took a subtle turn. He inquired about the placement of these wires, their apparent purpose, and I saw a flicker of something in Lady Ashworth's eyes, not just understanding, but a familiarity that seemed out of place amidst her sorrow. To prevent uncontrolled manifestations, you say? An interesting concept. One might imagine a sort of insulation against stray currents of etheric force, perhaps, replied Sherlock Holmes. She nodded, a little too readily, I thought. Precisely. She explained it was vital to ensure the path of energy was direct. Otherwise, the effects could be quite unpredictable. A poor connection, she said, could have disastrous consequences. Lady Ashworth replied. Holmes made no immediate comment, but his gaze lingered on her for a moment. He then shifted his line of inquiry, touching upon her life with Lord Ashworth. At first, her responses were guarded, conventional expressions of loss. But Holmes, with his uncanny ability to probe the human heart, gently persisted. Your husband was a man of strong convictions, I gather, and particular in his affairs, explained Sherlock Holmes. A shadow crossed her face, a tightening around her lips that spoke more than words. The dam of her composure seemed to crack, ever so slightly. Her voice lost its tremor, replaced by a thread of steel. My husband, Mr. Holmes, controlled everything. Every penny, every decision. My life was circumscribed. He believed a wife's place was one of obedience and thrift, even when there was no need for such stringency, answered Lady Ashworth. The resentment in her tone was palpable now, a stark contrast to her earlier display of sorrow. She spoke of years of emotional neglect, of being treated as little more than a possession, her own ambitions and desires systematically stifled. The desire for autonomy, for simple freedom, burned fiercely beneath her carefully constructed facade of the grieving widow. When we finally took our leave, the heavy oak door of Ashworth Manor closed behind us with a mournful thud. Holmes remained silent for some time as our cab rattled over the cobblestones. The rhythmic clatter of the horse's hooves was the only sound. At last he spoke, his voice thoughtful. A potent motive, Watson. Liberation from a gilded cage, financial and emotional. And did you observe her turn of phrase? A poor connection could have disastrous consequences. Ensure the path of energy was direct, not the typical parlance of a lady untutored in such matters, stated Sherlock Holmes. You believe she possesses some knowledge of electricity, Holmes, commented Dr. John Watson. I asked, somewhat taken aback. He gave a wry smile. More than she lets on, I suspect. A woman scorned, and one with an unexpectedly practical grasp of certain principles. However, motive and a degree of understanding do not solely construct a murder, Watson. We need the hand that manipulated the apparatus, the mind that understood Professor Flemming's genius not as theory, but as a tool. Our next inquiry, I fancy, must be with someone whose daily bread is earned through the very currents that ended Lord Ashworth's life. An electrician, perhaps, whose expertise might prove most illuminating. Sherlock Holmes observed sharply. His words hung in the air, a clear indication of our next path, and I felt that familiar thrill of the chase, the intricate puzzle beginning to reveal its complex, sinister design. Lady Ashworth's understated familiarity with electrical principles still puzzled me. But Holmes had already moved on, his mind racing ahead as always. The scent of damp London air, heavy with coal smoke, filled our cab as we rattled over the cobblestones towards the address he had procured. His voice cut through the rhythmic clatter of the horses' hooves. Lady Ashworth's knowledge, however elementary, suggests a more proficient mind at work in these tragic affairs, Watson. Our inquiries must now lead us to Mr. Thomas Blackwood, an electrician whose name has surfaced more than once in connection with the Spiritualist Society. Sherlock Holmes pointed out. We alighted in a rather grimy thoroughfare. The air, thick with the smells of industry, carried the distant, rhythmic clatter of machinery from a nearby factory. A low, persistent hum, as of unseen currents at play, seemed to emanate from Blackwood's workshop itself. The building was a modest, two-story affair, its windows coated with a fine layer of city dust, obscuring the view within. Holmes stepped forward and delivered a sharp rap upon the wooden door. The door opened to reveal a man of middling height, with calloused hands and eyes that, despite a veneer of civility, seemed to take in every detail of our appearance. This was Thomas Blackwood. He gestured us inside. His workshop, though cluttered with wires, tools, and strange metallic contraptions, possessed a certain underlying order. The faint, sharp scent of ozone, a familiar aroma in places of electrical experimentation, hung distinctly in the air, mingling with the metallic tang of solder. "Mr. Thomas Blackwood, I presume," Holmes began, his tone courteous yet penetrating. Deduced Sherlock Holmes. "That is my name, sirs. And how may I be of service?" His voice was unexpectedly resonant, firm, and without tremor. Thomas Blackwood answered. Holmes swiftly outlined our interest in the unfortunate events surrounding the Spiritualist Society, focusing particularly on the peculiar electrical phenomena reported. Blackwood listened intently, his expression unreadable. "Your expertise in the field of electrical apparatus is, I understand, quite considerable, Mr. Blackwood," remarked Sherlock Holmes. "I make an honest living by my trade, Mr. Holmes," he replied evenly. "I work with currents and coils, nothing more mysterious," responded Thomas Blackwood. When Holmes pressed him regarding his whereabouts during the times of the recent fatalities, Blackwood's composure remained absolute. He moved to a large, roll-top desk, the scrape of his chair briefly disturbing the workshop's quiet, and produced a series of ledgers and signed work dockets with a soft rustle of paper. With remarkable clarity, his voice steady, and even Blackwood detailed his movements. For the first incident, he presented a work docket from a Cheapside merchant, meticulously logged with precise start and end times, countersigned by the foreman. The rhythmic tick-tock of a large regulator clock on the wall seemed to measure out his calm recitation. For the second, he produced receipts for materials purchased in Lambeth, followed by timed omnibus tickets. He even offered an attestation from a city policeman regarding a brief exchange about a stray dog near the time of the third unfortunate event, the paper crisp as he laid it before Holmes. Each piece of evidence was presented with the same unwavering confidence. It was a veritable fortress of corroborated fact, so thoroughly constructed, each detail interlocking with the next, that it appeared impregnable. "It seems quite unshakable, Holmes," I whispered, awed by the man's meticulous records. Asked Dr. John Watson. A flicker of something akin to intellectual delight sparked in Holmes's eyes. "Indeed, Watson, almost too unshakable. A narrative woven with such extraordinary precision often betrays the weaver's diligent hand more than the truth of the pattern itself," Sherlock Holmes responded. Holmes spent some time perusing the ledgers, his gaze sharp and focused, while Blackwood stood by, a model of calm confidence. The faint hum of an electrical coil somewhere in the room was the only sound for a long moment. "You maintain, then, Mr. Blackwood, that these documents provide a complete and irrefutable account of your activities on the days in question," remarked Sherlock Holmes. "To the very minute, Mr. Holmes," Blackwood affirmed, his voice tinged with an unmistakable note of pride. "Verified and attested. I value my reputation for punctuality and meticulousness above all," said Thomas Blackwood. My friend offered no direct challenge. Instead, a thoughtful expression settled upon his features. The sheer perfection of the alibi, rather than dispelling his suspicions, seemed to have presented him with a challenge he found utterly absorbing. "A most formidable construction, Mr. Blackwood," Holmes said at last, his tone deceptively mild. "You have certainly provided us with a great deal to contemplate." Sherlock Holmes pointed out. We took our leave shortly thereafter. The door of the workshop closed behind us with a decisive click, instantly muffling the low hum of machinery and sealing away the sharp scent of ozone. Once back in the comparative anonymity of the bustling London street, the cacophony of horse-drawn drays, street vendors' cries, and our own footsteps echoing on the pavement enveloped us. I turned to my companion. "Well, Holmes, what is your assessment? That alibi appeared to me as solid as the Bank of England," Dr. John Watson said. He smiled faintly, his eyes bright with the thrill of the chase. "As solid as a well-oiled lock, Watson, and like any such intricate mechanism, there is always a key to be found, or a subtle flaw in its design. Mr. Blackwood has not merely offered a denial. He has presented us with an elaborately crafted puzzle. The very labor invested in its meticulous architecture is, in itself, profoundly suggestive. Such fastidious care in defense often points to an equally fastidious preparation for the act it seeks to conceal," Sherlock Holmes observed sharply. He paused, his gaze distant. The first gas lamps sputtered to life, casting a yellow glow upon the darkening street, their gentle hiss a counterpoint to the city's receding din. "The threads of this peculiar affair," Holmes mused, almost to himself, "are interwoven with a degree of skill that speaks of more than mere electrical competence. It suggests a stage manager of considerable talent, one who understands the art of illusion as profoundly as the science of currents." His words, I felt, were already guiding us towards our next avenue of inquiry. The perplexing solidity of Thomas Blackwood's alibi continued to occupy Holmes's thoughts for some time after our interview. He paced our Baker Street rooms, the floorboards creaking a familiar rhythm beneath his feet, a furrow etched deep upon his brow. The distant, mournful cry of a foghorn drifted up from the Thames, a fitting sound for the miasma of deception we sought to penetrate. His voice, when he finally spoke, was sharp with renewed purpose. "Blackwood's defense is a remarkable edifice, Watson, built with cunning and precision. Yet, while we chip away at its foundations, let us not neglect the principal architect of these spectral performances, Madame Evangeline. If she is the puppeteer, we must understand the strings she pulls," Sherlock Holmes said. His restless energy found a new focus. "Her past, Watson, her true origins, there must lie a clue to her methods." And so it was that the following morning, after a hurried breakfast accompanied by the clatter of milk pails in the street below, we found ourselves amidst the hushed, dusty confines of the London Theatrical Archives. The air within was heavy with the scent of decaying paper and old leather bindings. Sunlight struggled to pierce the tall, grimy windows, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to writhe with the ghosts of forgotten performances. The only sounds were the rustle of turning pages and the occasional dry cough from a stooped clerk in a far corner. Holmes, however, moved with an almost feverish intensity, his long fingers flicking through catalogues and playbills with astonishing speed. Hours passed. I had begun to weary of the endless columns of names and dates when Holmes emitted a low grunt of satisfaction. "Ah, Watson, observe." He held up a rather faded and foxed playbill, his voice tinged with triumph. "The Alhambra Music Hall, 1875. Behold Mademoiselle Clara Miggs, the mistress of marvels. Clara Miggs, I inquired, peering at the florid script. And what is her significance, Holmes? Asked Dr. John Watson. His eyes gleamed. Patience, my dear fellow. Further research into Mademoiselle Miggs proved most illuminating, declared Sherlock Holmes. He tapped the aged playbill with a long finger, a spark of excitement in his usually cool gaze. It seems our Clara, he continued, was a rather notorious stage magician, specializing in illusions of a, shall we say, spiritualistic bent, observed Sherlock Holmes. A stage magician, Holmes. With such a specialty, I asked, the pieces beginning to shift in my own mind. Wondered Dr. John Watson. Indeed, and most significantly, Watson, she vanished from the theatrical circuit some 15 years ago, shortly before our Madame Evangeline first graced London society with her ethereal presence, replied Sherlock Holmes. The scene shifted to 221. Be a crackling fire dispelled the autumn chill as Holmes, pipe smoke curling above, elaborated on his deductions. Consider her repertoire, Watson. Clara Miggs was renowned for an illusion called the spectral messenger, explained Sherlock Holmes. The spectral messenger, I queried. What manner of performance was that? Responded Dr. John Watson. Contemporary accounts describe how, in a darkened room, a luminous, vaguely human form would appear to hover, delivering cryptic messages before dissolving into nothingness, stated Sherlock Holmes. I pictured the scene, the hushed anticipation, the eerie glow. Holmes, meanwhile, ticked off the elements on his fingers. The mechanism, though cleverly concealed, involved strategically placed mirrors, subtle phosphorus paint, and a confederate with a voice-projecting apparatus, observed Sherlock Holmes. So, pure artifice, then, designed to prey on the imagination, I observed, responded Dr. John Watson. Precisely. The key, as with all such illusions, was misdirection, focusing the audience's attention here, he gestured vaguely, whilst the true manipulation occurred there, stated Sherlock Holmes. He leaned forward, his voice dropping slightly, compelling my full attention. Does this not resonate with the phenomena reported at Madame Evangeline's séances? The fleeting lights, the disembodied whispers, the very air of controlled spectacle. He paused, allowing the implications to settle in the quiet room, the only sound the gentle hiss and pop of the fire. It is stagecraft, Watson, refined and adapted, but stagecraft nonetheless. Then you are certain, I pressed, the audacity of the deception dawning on me. Madame Evangeline, commented Dr. John Watson, is, I am utterly convinced, the erstwhile Clara Miggs, Holmes concluded, his voice firm, employing her old skills for a new and infinitely more sinister purpose, remarked Sherlock Holmes. Good heavens, Holmes, I exclaimed. A stage magician. It explains her poise, her ability to command a room, to direct belief, commented Dr. John Watson. He nodded, a grim satisfaction in his expression. Precisely. Her past provides the motive of skill, the how, stated Sherlock Holmes. He rose then, his earlier languor entirely vanished, replaced by the keen energy that always signaled a new phase of the hunt. Now, we must uncover the specific means by which she has electrified her old tricks. This knowledge of her past deceptions illuminates the path forward, stated Sherlock Holmes. The electrical apparatus, then, I surmised. That must be the key to this modern manifestation of her illusions, remarked Dr. John Watson. Indeed, our next logical step, Watson, is to examine the stage itself, the séance parlor of Madame Evangeline. We must see what secrets its walls conceal, observed Sherlock Holmes. A new, determined light shone in his eyes. The game, as he was so fond of saying, was once more afoot, and the scent of discovery was keen in the air, promising revelations yet to come in the heart of that darkened room. The chill of the late autumn evening had seeped into the very marrow of London. My heart quickened, as I followed Holmes through the shadowed alleyway leading to the rear of Madame Evangeline's establishment, every crunch of gravel underfoot seeming to echo in the stillness. The distant clatter of a late-night omnibus on Baker Street was the only other sound to break the oppressive silence, save for the faint, metallic click as Holmes expertly manipulated the lock on a narrow service door. A gust of stale air, heavy with the cloying scent of incense and something indefinably chemical, met us as we slipped inside. The séance parlor itself was shrouded in gloom, the heavy velvet curtains drawn tight, admitting no glimmer from the gas lamps outside. Holmes, however, moved with a cat-like surety, his pocket lantern casting a focused beam that danced across the ornate and rather theatrical furnishings. I could hear the soft scuff of his shoes on the thick carpet, a counterpoint to the faint creak of the floorboards beneath my own more cautious tread. He ignored the central table, the crystal ball, the various paraphernalia of the medium's trade, his attention drawn instead to the periphery of the room. His voice was a low hum in the darkness. The true stage, Watson, is seldom where the audience is directed to look. Our Madame Evangeline, or rather Miss Clara Miggs, would understand the art of misdirection better than most, Sherlock Holmes said. His fingers, long and nimble, traced the elaborate skirting board. He paused, rapped lightly, then with a small lever produced from his pocket, prized away a section of the ornate woodwork. Behind it, nestled against the wall, lay not the expected brick or plaster, but a series of insulated wires, far newer and of a different caliber to the house's original electrical fittings. My breath caught in my throat at the sheer audacity of their concealment. The care taken was extraordinary, for no casual inspection would ever have revealed their presence. I whispered, the sound seeming loud in the stillness. "Good heavens, Holmes, what is this?" Dr. John Watson replied. As he drew out a peculiar dark grey conduit, Holmes whispered, his voice tinged with excitement. "This, my dear Watson, is the serpent in Eden. Feel the material, unlike any standard electrical insulation. It's almost inert to the touch, yet remarkably resilient." Sherlock Holmes responded. He produced a small lens and examined a junction box, cleverly disguised as part of the wainscoting. The components within were meticulously assembled, their craftsmanship of a high order. The air around them seemed to carry a faint, almost imperceptible hum, a vibration I could feel more than hear. His voice was crisp with deduction. "This shielding, Watson, is the key. I'll wager it's made from Professor Flemming's special electromagnetic resistant alloy," deduced Sherlock Holmes. "This material allows for the creation of a completely separate, high-powered electrical pathway, cleverly hidden alongside the house's normal wiring. Think of it as a secret channel for electricity," stated Sherlock Holmes. "Because it's so well shielded by this unique alloy, it becomes entirely invisible to any standard safety device or routine inspection." I stared at the intricate arrangement, the implications chilling me to the bone. The sheer technical sophistication was astounding, the planning meticulous. This was no crude contraption devised by some common miscreant. It spoke of a calculating intelligence and profound technical knowledge. His eyes gleamed in the lantern light. "Imagine the purpose, Watson. A deadly electrical current precisely aimed at one spot in this room," deduced Sherlock Holmes. "It would bypass all the usual safety measures, every fuse, every switch designed to prevent such a thing," declared Sherlock Holmes. "This creates a lethal kill zone, as it were, which would leave no evidence on the house's normal electrical system. The perfect, untraceable weapon, all hidden behind the smoke and mirrors of the spirit world," replied Sherlock Holmes. Suddenly, a floorboard creaked in the passage beyond the parlor door. Holmes's hand shot out, extinguishing the lantern in an instant, plunging us into absolute blackness. We stood frozen, listening. The soft rustle of silk, the faint click of a door handle further down the corridor, then retreating footsteps. My heart hammered against my ribs. After an agonizing minute of silence, punctuated only by the distant chime of a mantel clock from another room, Holmes relit the lantern, its beam now seeming almost impertinent in the heavy silence. Her voice drifted, somewhat muffled, from what sounded like a nearby chamber. "Is anyone there? I thought I heard," Madame Evangeline said. Her words faded, followed by the soft thud of a closing door. The close call had unnerved me, but Holmes appeared entirely unperturbed. He carefully replaced the skirting board, leaving no sign of our intrusion. The meticulous, deliberate concealment of this deadly apparatus spoke volumes of the perpetrator's cunning and technical prowess. It was a level of sophistication far beyond a mere theatrical charlatan, pointing to a deeper, more sinister organization. His voice was once more a low murmur. "The craftsmanship of these components, Watson, and the specific nature of this shielded conduit, it bears the hallmark of a particular group," replied Sherlock Holmes. "Their interest in advanced, and often illicit, applications of electricity is well known to me. Our next visit, I fancy, must be to the suspected workshops of the Clockwork Gang." The chill of the late autumn evening bit at us, as Holmes led the way down a narrow, refuse-strewn alley in a less salubrious quarter of the city. The air was thick with the scent of damp brick and coal smoke, and the distant, mournful hoot of a barge on the Thames underscored the desolation. He paused before a battered, unmarked door, the wood splintered and bearing the scars of rough usage. His voice was a low murmur, barely audible above the city's drone. "If my deductions are correct, Watson, this is the den of our Clockwork Gang. Their ingenuity in Madame Evangeline's parlor must have its wellspring somewhere," remarked Sherlock Holmes. With a deft manipulation of a slender piece of steel, Holmes coaxed the rudimentary lock into submission. The door groaned inwards, protesting with a drawn-out creak that echoed into the darkness beyond. We slipped inside, Holmes moving with a cat-like tread. The interior was a cavernous warehouse, dimly lit by a few gas lamps. The air hummed faintly, a subtle vibration underfoot, and the metallic tang of ozone and hot oil was distinct. Piles of brass cogs, wires, and strange mechanical contrivances lay scattered about in apparent disarray. He gestured towards a workbench. "Observe, Watson. Coils of insulated wire, identical to those we uncovered. And here, fragments of that peculiar, dark material Professor Flemming so prizes." My companion's keen eyes then fell upon a large table, upon which were spread several sheets of meticulously drawn schematics. He snatched one up, his brow furrowing. The silence in the warehouse, save for a dripping pipe and a distant dray, seemed to deepen. A flicker of understanding, then grim certainty, hardened his features. As he traced a finger along one diagram, his voice, when he finally spoke, was tight with controlled intensity. "Astounding, Watson. These plans reveal a far more sinister purpose than mere seance trickery. Fleming's material forms a deadly conduit, an invisible path for a lethal electrical charge, bypassing all safety measures." His attention shifted from the schematics to a heavy ledger and a sheaf of correspondence tucked beneath it. He scanned the pages, his expression growing ever more grave. For a long moment, only the scratching of his fingernail against paper broke the silence. Peering over his shoulder, I glimpsed a maze of figures, names, and cryptic notations. Finally, he looked up, his eyes like chips of ice. "This confirms my gravest suspicions, Watson. The Clockwork Gang are far more than suppliers of theatrical props," deduced Sherlock Holmes. I waited, the implications of his tone chilling me despite the stuffy air of the warehouse. The grim set of his jaw told of a discovery far darker than simple fraud. "What have you found?" I urged, my voice hushed. Wondered Dr. John Watson. "Their primary enterprise," he stated, tapping the ledger with a grim finality, "is the development and sale of this insidious electrical weapon, an advanced, remotely triggered assassination device." Sherlock Holmes noted. Assassination. The word echoed in the cavernous space, heavy and monstrous. The pieces of the puzzle, the bizarre deaths, the electrical burns, Professor Flemming's unique material began to coalesce into a terrifying, undeniable picture. Precisely. The spiritualist charade, as these letters reveal, serves a dual purpose. It is a proving ground, a method to test its efficacy on unsuspecting victims. And, he added, his voice hardening, to fulfill initial contracts for wealthy, unscrupulous clients, thereby demonstrating its lethality and establishing its market value. They are merchants of death, Watson, cloaked in the guise of mechanical novelty, Sherlock Holmes noted. Suddenly, the clatter of heavy boots on the cobblestones outside shattered the quiet, followed by rough voices and the jangle of keys. The main door at the far end of the warehouse was being unbolted. There was no time for concealment. Holmes snatched the most incriminating of the documents. His whisper was urgent. "This way, Watson, quickly," Sherlock Holmes said. He darted towards a grimy window at the rear, one I had barely noticed. With a swift, powerful movement, he forced the rusted latch. Shouts erupted behind us as the gang members burst in, their figures silhouetted against the gaslight. We scrambled through the narrow opening, dropping into the darkness of another alleyway just as a heavy object crashed against the wall where we had stood moments before. The sounds of pursuit echoed behind us, but the labyrinthine network of passages favored our flight. Panting, we finally emerged onto a busier thoroughfare, the cacophony of the London night swallowing the sounds of our pursuers. Holmes, despite our narrow escape, seemed invigorated, his mind already racing. The evidence we had secured was damning, the true nature of the electrifying spectre revealed. Now, the challenge was to counter such diabolical ingenuity. Following his perilous encounter with the Clockwork Gang, Holmes had thrown himself into a fever of activity. Our rooms at Baker Street became a curious laboratory, filled with coils of wire, curious brass instruments, the faint, sharp scent of ozone, and the low hum of some unseen electrical apparatus. He worked with a silent, almost grim intensity, the details of his purpose veiled from me, though I knew it concerned the dark machinations at Madame Evangeline's. His voice, when he finally spoke, was crisp. "Tonight, Watson, we shall attend another of Madame Evangeline's performances. I trust your nerves are steady," Sherlock Holmes observed sharply. "As steady as yours, Holmes, though I confess a degree of apprehension," I replied, eyeing a particularly intricate device he was carefully packing into a small leather case. Responded Dr. John Watson. The séance parlor was as I remembered it, heavy velvet curtains muffling the distant rumble of city carriages, the air thick with incense and the almost palpable anticipation of the attendees. Their hushed whispers and the occasional rustle of fabric were the only sounds. A dozen or so individuals, their faces pale in the flickering gaslight, sat around the familiar mahogany table. I noted Inspector Hardcastle amongst them, unobtrusive in a plain dress, her keen eyes missing nothing. Madame Evangeline, draped in dark silks, entered with her customary theatrical grace, her voice a low, sonorous hum as she began her preamble. "The spirits are restless tonight, my friends. They sense a presence among us. Let us open our hearts and minds to their ethereal whispers." Madame Evangeline replied. The gaslights were dimmed further, plunging the room into a deeper gloom, broken only by a few strategically placed candles that cast long, dancing shadows. The usual phenomena commenced. Faint, intermittent rappings from unseen corners, a cool breeze that seemed to emanate from nowhere, stirring the heavy curtains, and the soft, eerie glow of what she purported to be ectoplasm. I felt a familiar chill, despite my skepticism. Holmes sat perfectly still, his face an unreadable mask in the dim light. Then, as Madame Evangeline's voice rose, its pitch escalating as she called upon some spectral entity, I saw Holmes make a subtle movement. There was no grand gesture, merely a quiet, metallic click from the direction of his chair. A sound so faint it was almost lost beneath the medium's dramatic incantations and the nervous shifting of the attendees. The effect was instantaneous and startling. A faint blue spark, no larger than a firefly, briefly illuminated the underside of the table near Madame Evangeline. The air crackled with a sharp hiss, like lightning contained in a bottle. The ethereal glow vanished. The rappings ceased abruptly. A collective gasp, sharp and fearful, went around the table. Madame Evangeline faltered, her voice catching in her throat, the sonorous tone replaced by a choked silence. Her voice, now stripped of its mystical cadence, was sharp with alarm. What was that? The spirits are disturbed, Madame Evangeline said. His voice cut through the ensuing babble, calm and resonant. Not spirits, Madame, but rather a rudimentary electrical apparatus, I fancy. One which, it appears, is now rendered temporarily inert, stated Sherlock Holmes. He rose, the scrape of his chair loud in the sudden stillness. With a swift movement, he produced a small bull's-eye lantern. Its bright, focused beam cut through the darkness like a scalpel, illuminating the underside of the table. There, cleverly concealed amidst the table's structure, was a network of fine wires, small electromagnets, and a curious plate fashioned from a dull, grey material. The very substance I had seen Holmes examining from the schematics recovered from the gang. Inspector Hardcastle was on her feet at once, her expression grimly satisfied, the rustle of her dress sharp in the tense silence. Her tone was firm and official. Madame Evangeline, I believe you have some explaining to do. This charade is over. Inspector Evelyn Hardcastle replied. The attendees erupted in a cacophony of sound gasps of shock, murmurs of outrage, and confused questions filling the once hushed room. Madame Evangeline, her face a mask of fury and disbelief, seemed to shrink before our eyes. Later, as we departed that scene of chaos, the sounds of Hardcastle's methodical questioning fading behind us, Holmes vouchsafed a brief explanation of his countermeasure. The schematics, Watson, revealed the ingenious, albeit nefarious, application of Professor Flemming's unique grey material. Its primary property, you see, is a remarkable resistance to electromagnetic fields. This allowed the perpetrators to precisely channel and focus their electrical discharges, effectively aiming their supernatural effects, whilst simultaneously shielding their apparatus from detection by conventional means. My countermeasure was designed to overcome this very resistance. The targeted energy pulse I introduced was calibrated to temporarily negate the material's insulating qualities. By disrupting its ability to shield and direct the current, their entire system overloaded, causing the telltale spark and immediate failure of their deceitful machinery, all without endangering the attendees. A fascinating application of physics to expose a fraud, wouldn't you agree? Sherlock Holmes noted. I marveled then, not for the first time, at the depth of his scientific knowledge, so expertly wielded to dismantle such elaborate deceit. The trap had been sprung, the spectre's earthly tethers laid bare, yet I sensed the full unraveling of this dark affair was still to come. The following morning found us assembled within the somewhat stark confines of Inspector Hardcastle's office at Scotland Yard. The air, heavy with the scent of ink and official ledgers, seemed to crackle with an unspoken tension. Sunlight, fractured by the grimy window panes, cast long, accusing shadows across the room where Madame Evangeline sat, her usual theatrical composure visibly diminished, and a sullen Thomas Blackwood glowered beside her. Lady Ashworth, pale but resolute, completed the grim tableau. The distant, rhythmic tread of a constable's boots echoed from the corridor, a steady counterpoint to the city's low hum beyond the walls. Holmes stood before the fireplace, his keen expression matching his incisive tone as he broke the expectant silence. "Inspector," he began, "last night's spectral charade was merely a garish curtain. Behind it lay a far more tangible and sinister play. Madame Evangeline's considerable talents in stagecraft and misdirection served only to cloak the true machinations at work, stated Sherlock Holmes. He paused, his gaze sweeping over the accused. Madame Evangeline flinched, whilst Blackwood merely scowled more deeply. Let us address Mr. Blackwood's seemingly unshakable alibi for the death of Lord Ashworth. He was, by several accounts, including a notarized statement from a tobacconist and the testimony of a public house landlord, miles away, making purchases and engaging in conversation at the precise hour of his lordship's demise. A clever contrivance that, declared Sherlock Holmes. Holmes paced a step, the sound of his shoes sharp on the wooden floorboards. However, our investigation into Mr. Blackwood's alibi revealed its flaws. The tobacconist, a Mr. Josiah Miggs, was found to be heavily indebted to associates of the Clockwork Gang. More tellingly, his shop clerk, a prominent feature, showed clear signs of recent, deliberate manipulation. Its hands had been advanced. The public house landlord, too, was persuaded by a significant sum to confirm a false timeline. But the true cunning, Inspector, lay not merely in these falsified testimonies. It was in the remote activation of the lethal device. This mechanism was sophisticated enough to be triggered from a distance, meaning Blackwood's presence was necessary only for its initial installation, not for its fatal use, declared Sherlock Holmes. A low gasp escaped Lady Ashworth, though whether of surprise or fear I could not immediately discern. Inspector Hardcastle listened intently, her pen occasionally scratching across a notepad. Which brings us to the architect of this tragedy, Holmes continued, his tone softening almost imperceptibly as he turned towards Lady Ashworth. The instigator, who possessed the most compelling motive, Lady Ashworth herself. He spoke with a grave authority. Consider her circumstances: years of profound emotional cruelty, systematic financial ruin at her husband's hands, debts incurred against her name without her consent. These factors had driven her to a point of utter desperation. Her desire, Inspector, was not for wealth, but for autonomy, for a simple escape from an intolerable existence, observed Sherlock Holmes. Lady Ashworth raised her head, her eyes meeting Holmes's, a flicker of defiance mixed with an undeniable sorrow in their depths. Thus, the conspiracy took its shape. Lady Ashworth, seeking a means to her desperate end, found a facilitator in Madame Evangeline. Though manipulative, Evangeline's séances offered the perfect smokescreen of supernatural terror. Next, Thomas Blackwood, with his electrical expertise and crucial connections to the Clockwork Gang, provided the technological solution, the murder weapon itself. The gang, for their part, recognized a grim opportunity. They aimed to profit from their deadly invention, and by demonstrating its efficacy, to create a market for such discreet instruments of assassination. The hierarchy is therefore clear. Lady Ashworth, the primary beneficiary of her husband's demise; Madame Evangeline, the purveyor of deception; Blackwood, the engineer of death; and finally, the Clockwork Gang, the amoral suppliers of the fatal technology, replied Sherlock Holmes. The room was utterly still, save for the rustle of Inspector Hardcastle's papers as she prepared warrants. As for the mechanism of death itself, Holmes elucidated, his voice regaining its crisp, analytical edge. It was no spectre, Inspector, but applied science, twisted to a vile purpose. The device was cleverly concealed. Crucially, it was enhanced by Professor Flemming's unwittingly supplied electromagnetic-resistant material. This allowed it to deliver a precisely targeted electrical discharge. This current, Watson, was specifically calibrated to overwhelm certain nerve pathways, those controlling the heart, thereby inducing cardiac arrest. The electrical injuries we observed were, in fact, the subtle but undeniable hallmarks of this scientifically orchestrated murder. They were designed, of course, to appear as a consequence of spectral fury. Inspector Hardcastle rose, her expression firm. The sharp click of handcuffs being prepared was suddenly audible. Her voice was steady and clear. Madame Evangeline, Thomas Blackwood, Lady Ashworth, you are under arrest for the conspiracy to murder and the murder of Lord Ashworth. You will be conveyed to cells forthwith. Inspector Evelyn Hardcastle said. Madame Evangeline sagged, all artifice gone. Blackwood offered a curse under his breath. Lady Ashworth, however, met her fate with a strange, quiet dignity. As they were led away, the clatter of their footsteps receding down the stone corridor, Holmes turned to the window, gazing out at the bustling London street, a somber expression upon his face. The full unraveling had been achieved, yet the implications, I sensed, stretched far beyond this single, tragic case. The last of the autumn rain lashed against the window panes of 221B Baker Street, a mournful accompaniment to the crackling fire within. The affair of the Electrified Spectre had reached its grim conclusion. The machinations of Madame Evangeline and her murderous accomplices laid bare. Inspector Hardcastle sat with us, a teacup cradled in her hands, the usual briskness of her demeanor softened by a weary satisfaction. The scent of Holmes's strongest shag tobacco hung faintly in the air, a familiar comfort in the aftermath of such a dark business. Her voice was low, tinged with the fatigue of the preceding days. A sordid affair, gentlemen, from start to finish. The depths to which greed and a twisted desire for power can drive individuals never ceases to astonish me, answered Inspector Evelyn Hardcastle. Holmes, who had been staring into the flames, his long fingers steepled, slowly turned his gaze towards her. The light cast sharp shadows across his aquiline features. Indeed, Inspector. Yet it is not merely base human failings we have contended with here, Sherlock Holmes noted. He paused, his eyes glinting in the firelight, the reflection dancing in their depths. But their unholy alliance with the very instruments of progress. Technology, in the wrong hands, becomes a fearsome weapon, far more insidious than any cudgel or pistol, explained Sherlock Holmes. I considered his words. The fate of Lord Ashworth, and those before him, struck down by an unseen force born of scientific ingenuity, was a chilling testament to this truth. The power of belief, so cynically manipulated by Evangeline, had rendered her victims tragically vulnerable. And the credulity, Holmes, to think that in this age of reason, so many fell prey to such elaborate charlatanry. It boggles the mind, Dr. John Watson said. Ah, Watson, belief is a potent force, often impervious to reason. Madame Evangeline understood that well, explained Sherlock Holmes. Her methods were a calculated blend of psychological suggestion and cunning stagecraft, even before the introduction of Flemming's unwitting contribution. She preyed upon the raw edges of grief, the desperate yearning for connection with the departed, declared Sherlock Holmes. Holmes leaned forward slightly, his gaze intense, as if dissecting the very fabric of Evangeline's deceit. Our investigations confirm as much. She employed a network of informants to gather intimate details about her clientele, their losses, their hopes, their secret fears. This information was then fed back to her, allowing for those chillingly accurate messages from the spirits. And the séances themselves were masterpieces of misdirection, strategically placed assistance, subtle sounds, even changes in temperature, all designed to heighten the atmosphere of supernatural communion. Inspector Evelyn Hardcastle said. Precisely, Inspector. The flickering gasoliers, the strategically dimmed lights, the faint scent of ozone she attributed to spiritual energy, all were part of an elaborate theater. The electrical apparatus, initially for mere spectacle, became her ultimate tool of terror and control, once its deadly potential was realized by her and her confederates. She wove the hum of the generators and the crackle of stray discharges into her narrative, making the lethal shocks appear as unfortunate, if tragic, manifestations of an overeager spirit world. Sherlock Holmes said. I shuddered, recalling the accounts of those final, fatal séances. The sheer audacity of her deception, coupled with its murderous outcome, was truly monstrous. But it is the plight of Professor Flemming that gives me particular pause, deduced Sherlock Holmes. Inspector Hardcastle nodded, her expression grave. I spoke with him at length. The man is utterly devastated, Inspector. He had no inkling his research into electrical shielding, intended for purely scientific advancement, for protecting delicate experiments, he claimed, could be so perverted. He cooperated fully, providing every detail of his work once he understood its horrific application, remarked Inspector Evelyn Hardcastle. Her words painted a picture of a man broken by the unintended consequences of his own genius. Holmes rose, his tall frame casting a long shadow in the flickering firelight, and began to pace the length of the hearthrug. The floorboards creaked faintly beneath his deliberate tread, a familiar sound when he was wrestling with a complex thought. Precisely. Professor Flemming is a man of science, dedicated to the pursuit of knowledge. His work on high-voltage electrical fields and their containment was, by all accounts, groundbreaking, deduced Sherlock Holmes. He paused for a moment before the window, gazing out at the rain-swept street, where gas lamps cast shimmering reflections on the wet pavement. He then turned back, tapping his long fingers lightly together. There is no evidence, not a shred, to suggest he ever envisioned its use as an instrument of murder. His shock was genuine, his horror profound. He is a tragic figure in this, Inspector. I glanced at Inspector Hardcastle, who nodded in solemn agreement, her gaze fixed on Holmes. A testament to the ethical tightrope walked by all pioneers. For how can a man foresee every twisted path down which his discoveries might be dragged by the unscrupulous? Sherlock Holmes responded. He paused again before the window, the lights of London reflecting dimly in the glass, streaked with rain. The distant rumble of a late-night omnibus was the only sound for a moment. There is no culpability on his part, certainly, Inspector Hardcastle conceded, her tone firm. But it underscores the immense responsibility that accompanies such advanced knowledge. His work, so benign in its conception, became the keystone of their lethal design. Inspector Evelyn Hardcastle answered. His voice was somber, yet edged with that familiar intellectual fire as he turned from the window, his gaze sweeping over me and then Hardcastle. Indeed, and it is a challenge that will only grow more acute, Watson, as the pace of invention quickens. We have peered into the ether, so to speak, and seen how new wonders can beget new terrors, deduced Sherlock Holmes. He made a sweeping gesture with one hand, as if encompassing the unseen forces they had just battled. Each advancement brings with it a shadow, a potential for misuse that we must be ever vigilant to anticipate and counter, explained Sherlock Holmes. A log shifted and settled in the grate then, sending a brief shower of orange sparks upwards into the chimney. The room was quiet for a beat, save for the persistent hiss of the flames and the drumming of rain against the glass. The human capacity for ingenuity is matched only by its capacity for malevolence. That, perhaps, is the most enduring lesson of this electrifying venture, Sherlock Holmes observed sharply. He turned from the window, a ghost of his keen smile touching his lips as the firelight danced in his eyes. The case was closed, but its implications would linger long in our minds.